think we're working. Welcome to Uncolored. I'm Kevin Metcalf. And today we're going to go through a video where we're having somebody who is, or a couple of guys are putting forth an idea. Now, you've heard the idea before, at least I've talked about it on the show before. And whether or not you agree with the idea is not the point here. What I want to focus on is how these two gentlemen, or the one person who's going to be talking about this, how they explain the idea. And what I would just like you to do, or at least what I'm going to do, is I'm going to go through some of the things that I think probably need to be thought about or given more thought than what's been given by the people who are presenting the idea. Now, just before we even start in the defense of the people who are going to be presenting the idea, this isn't a full explanation of their particular position. So they're not going to explain it as well as I would imagine they would have if this whole presentation that they're doing is focused on this particular idea. This is just a small part of the video. They kind of run through it, and it seems as though they either A, assume that everybody understands the idea and the particular ideas that make up the main idea, or B, for whatever reason, it just doesn't need explanation. Because the video actually goes on to talk about, spends most of the time talking about someone else's idea. And we'll get into that later. But I just want you to again, have an investigator's mind. When people are telling you things, you got to ask questions. You have to see if these people who are telling you these things have actually really thought about the idea. And I'll tell you, when I saw this, I get the impression that these gentlemen really haven't thought this through. But again, you'll see for yourself. So what we're going to be looking at is this video here with these two guys. The guy on the left, his name is Derek Murrell, as it says right there, and David Lewis. They have two separate channels that they talk about. And the idea that they talk about is an idea in theism called Calvinism. They're both affirmed Calvinists. And if you know anything about the channel here, I've talked about it before, Calvinism. I think it's a terrible idea, but that's just what I think. I don't care. You want to be a Calvinist, that's your thing. You got to wear the clothes in your closet, not mine. But it seems to me that many of the ideas in this idea of Calvinism are very poorly thought out. And I think they're okay with that, the people who support Calvinism. I think they recognize that there are huge logical problems with this idea. And I really just want to stress this one point. I think that if your ideas are not logically sound, they're probably bad ideas. And I don't think people either A, take the time to see if their ideas are logically sound, or B, if their ideas are not logically sound, rather than give up the idea that isn't logically sound, they will give up any logical foundation. They'll say logic is bad, my idea is good. And this is not just about Calvinism. This is a wider problem, I think, in society at large, where you have what they say it's a postmodern society, and it is. But the basic idea behind postmodernism is that the logical blueprint that God created the world with, people hate that because it limits what you can do. And it makes I shouldn't say very clear picture, but there's a clear picture of what is right and what is wrong, and it's objective. And I think people don't like that. And when the things that they want and the ideas that they have bump up against this objective world that God creates, that you can understand through reason and logic, rather than go, well, the world that God created tells me that this isn't really a good idea, they get rid of reason and logic so that they can have the idea. And I think this is what's going on here. But let's take a look at the video. And the first part of it here, I think, is David Lewis. And he's going to give you his credentials. And I think this is important because, so when I first saw this thing, I saw it on Dr. Flower's channel probably a year ago or so. I don't know. It was a while ago. at the time that I was studying this idea of Calvinism. And so I wanted to hear, what Calvinists thought, because it's their idea. um, and so when I saw the thing that I'm going to show you, I was kind of taken aback at what a poor display of thinking this demonstrates. And so as I, got the original video, went to the web to their channel and got the original video, I looked at the whole part. I didn't see the whole thing because, again, they're talking about a different idea that I'm not really concerned with, which is called provisionism, but that's a whole different thing. I was just concerned with their illustration. And so when I looked at the whole part, I was stunned to find out that this young man, David Lewis, he's a well-educated guy. He's not an idiot. He's a really smart guy, a very accomplished academic. And I don't know, I was a little surprised that this was the idea that he had come up with. So I want you to hear first. These are his credentials. He's talking about himself. And so these are his credentials.
I love your intro video, man. That's legit. Dave Lewis, apologetics from the attic. Married, 4 kids. Went to seminary at Trinity School for Ministry, Anglican Seminary. Got a master's in church history, systematic theology, and it's been about a year and a couple months since I've thrown my hat into the wild west of online apologetics. And
so I just want you to stop right there, or stop it right there. So this is not a dumb guy. He's been to seminary, right, which I think is some sort of a theological, college where you study the Bible. He's got a master's degree. That is not easy to do. That takes a lot of study. And I'm not even sure what the topic is, church history, whatever it is. It's not easy to get a master's. You have to be really smart to do that, and it's a lot of hard work. And I just want to make it clear at the beginning, because I didn't know this when I saw what I'm going to show you. This is not a dumb guy. I just want to make that clear. Very intelligent. Listen, he's smart. I'm an art school dropout. I didn't finish college, didn't finish my degree, went straight into the workforce. I couldn't do what this guy did, or at least I didn't. This guy's really, really smart. If you go by the academic achievements that he has, I just want to make that clear. Not an idiot we're listening to. Now, what he's going to illustrate and the idea that he's going to explain is an idea called compatibilism. Okay. I'm going to be stopping the video at various points throughout because, again, they don't really explain the whole idea with, I think, the depth that's necessary for people who aren't familiar with it. Now, if you're familiar with it, you still, I think, there's some explanation that's necessary that's missing here. So I'm going to be stopping the video and explaining some of the things that I think need more explanation. But just so you know, compatibilism is the idea that determinism is true and human responsibility is true. And they're somehow compatible. Okay. Now, if you're not familiar with determinism, there's different kinds of determinism, and depending on who you're talking to as a determinist, you can adjust. But determinism, what we'll call hard determinism, is the idea that everything that happens is because of something else. There's some original source that makes everything happen. There was a video that I did a while ago about this gal named Sabine Hassenfelder, who's a physicist, and she's an atheist. And she's also a determinist. She thinks that the Big Bang makes everything that happens, even your thoughts, your emotions, and all those things. Well, if you're a theistic determinist, you think that the thing that makes you do everything you do is God. Now, again, depending on who you're talking to, there's all kinds of, intellectual machinations that go on. But the main idea is this. It's something like God, before anything was created, wrote a script, like sort of a Hollywood producer or writer. And everything that happens Everything that has happened in all of human history, in the history of the planets, even before we've gotten here, was written in a script to happen exactly the way it did. And nothing that occurs is outside the script, right? There's no breaking character. Every planet moved the way it did. Every atom moves the way it did. Every thought happens the way it was scripted to happen. Now, this script, oftentimes, the Calvinist will refer to as the decree of God. God wrote it in his decree. And so nothing happens outside the decree. Well, the problem with that is, many people like me think is, well, if everything that I do was scripted out before I even did it, and it was impossible for me not to do it, how can I be held responsible for the things that I do? Because it's impossible for me not to do the things that God scripted for me to do. So there's this conflict of ideas. It's like we talked about earlier, the 3 rules of logic. This is the law of non-contradiction. And so this contradiction is there in this idea called Calvinism, whether you're a compatibilist or a non-compatibilist in Calvinism, or if you're an atheist and you're just a straight determinist or a compatibilist. The same problem is there. If everything that happens is determined by some preceding or antecedent cause, then how can you say we're responsible for the things that we do? One idea seems to exclude the possibility of the other idea. And if it's true that we're responsible for our actions, then it seems impossible that everything we do is determined by something else. So the problem is that both can't be true. If you're just thinking logically about it, okay? What the compatibilist says is, oh yeah, they're both true. Now, when you say, well, how could it possibly be true? They don't know how. They have no clue. They just go, it's true. So he's going to explain why he thinks this works, why he thinks that 2 ideas that couldn't possibly be true are actually true. That's what he's going to illustrate here. All right, here we go.
All right. So, yeah, I just want to make a point about what I think, and you'll see this in a couple of scriptures we're going to go over, the idea of compatibilism and how I, as a compatibilist, am able to see in passages of scripture 2 truths taught alongside each other that are not contradictory but complementary, and it does go into the area of divine mystery.
Okay, let's stop right there. There's a couple of ideas that we should go over again. So what he's saying is that these 2 ideas of determinism and human responsibility, he says they're not contradictory, but they're compatible. Again, it would be nice for some explanation as to how that could be, but it's not forthcoming here. What he's simply going to tell you is that when he's reading the Bible, he sees determinism and he sees human responsibility. He says he just sees them both. That's why he says there are 2 truths. Okay, now, logically speaking, that's impossible. Unless one of the things isn't exactly what you're saying it is. And that's a lot of times what compatibilists will do is when they say determinism and you go, that means everything's determined, they'll say that. But then they'll talk as if that's not the case. And so it's a bit of equivocating. There's a lot of equivocation that goes on, at least in my experience in listening to these discussions. But the idea that there are 2 truths is false. That's impossible. Only one can be true. And so the compatibilist, if he's going to say both are true, needs to have an explanation as to how 2 things that cancel each other out can both be true. To just say they're both true because I see it, in my opinion, is not good enough. There has to be some explanation as to why I should believe that 2 things that are impossible to be true are actually true. That's just how it seems to me. The other idea is the idea of mystery. Okay. That's typically the explanation you're going to get from a theistic compatibilist. When you say, how is it possible that God determines everything and we're still responsible for the things we do, even though God determines the things that we do? What they'll tell you is that it's a mystery. And sometimes they'll dress it up by saying it's divine mystery. Okay. They're both the same idea. The problem is what I think the Calvinist in this circumstance is doing is confusing contradiction with mystery. They're not the same thing. Okay. A contradiction is two things that both can't be true. They're two propositional statements. Both of them can't be true. That's what a contradiction is. What a mystery is simply the fact that there are some things that are beyond your sphere of knowledge at that moment. Now, maybe you'll come in contact with these things that you did not know before. But if you have in your sphere of knowledge contradictory data, it's not a mystery. That's a problem. That means you don't understand the data properly. And in my opinion, the laws of logic are God's way of telling you you're not getting it right, because God, his very nature is logic. I think that's why he's called the Logos. The seventh word in the Bible. I don't think God tells us things that are contradictions or has things in reality that are contradictions. As a matter of fact, you know what? I've done this before, and I'm going to keep doing it because this keeps coming up. This is from Stuart Hackett from a book called The Resurrection of Theism. And I think what he's saying is right on point. He says, if a statement about the real world is self-contradictory, then it is false. And this not merely in the sense that the statement is internally absurd, but also in the sense that it is a false account of the real world itself. So what Stuart is saying, or Dr. Hackett, I should say, what it seems like he's saying is that it's impossible for two contradictory ideas to be true. Okay. And what I find when I'm listening to people who are theists, and here's again an accomplished, theology academic, what they seem to do is they carve out this special area for absurd ideas that they think come from the Bible. But everything else they conform to logic. And I'm not sure why you would think that there are just certain things in the Bible that are absurd and illogical, but everything else has to be logical. Because if Stuart Hackett, if I'm understanding him properly, what he's saying is that it's impossible for two contradictory ideas to be true, because it destroys any way of knowing anything. Because the only way you can disagree with anything is because it's logically untenable. He goes on to say, for if we assert that a self-contradiction is true, then we're rejecting a principle upon which the possibility of any assertion at all rests, namely, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same manner. And he says, if this principle is false, no knowledge is possible, not even the knowledge that a contradiction is true. And so what Hackett is saying is that if you're going to have two ideas that contradict each other, and these two ideas clearly seem to contradict each other, but assert that they're both true, then the problem you have is you now can't object when any idea is contradictory. Because now you're just special pleading. You're going to go, well, this idea that's contradictory is true, but that idea that person has over there, well, that's clearly contradictory. So that's not true. But the problem is they can say the same thing that you're saying, that, well, it's going to be worked out someplace in eternity. And so now anybody can hold whatever contradiction they want, because you've opened the door for absurd ideas to be true. And I think that's what Hackett is getting at, is that you destroy all possibility of knowledge once you allow for certain ideas to be self-contradictory. And I think that's the problem here. So let's continue on with David's presentation.
Which I've noticed many times we will get criticized for punting to mystery. But, I could accuse the other side of being overly rationalistic and trying to find philosophy and, find logic in everything and not say, well, there's a mystery to this. It doesn't make sense, but the biblical revelation teaches it.
So again, this is a confusion or a conflation of mystery and contradiction. Here's another way to look at it. Let's say that you're a cop on the beat and you come across a dead body, 2 bullet holes in the back. Okay, so you call out the homicide detectives, and the detective shows up and looks at the body and goes, oh, this is clearly a suicide. Now you start thinking about this and looking at the data, and there's no other information other than this guy laying down with 2 holes in his back. And you go, well, detective, how could it possibly be a suicide? Because it seems impossible that somebody can shoot themselves in the back once, let alone 2 times. Why would you think it's a suicide? Now, if he said, well, it's a beautiful mystery and we'll just figure it out sometime in eternity, I'd call another detective out. It seems that he's misreading the data, because it's not a mystery how the guy died. We're looking at it. The mystery is who killed him. That's information beyond your sphere of knowledge at that time. Contradictions are not mysteries. The other part that he said, the idea that all ideas don't have to be logically sound, that blew me away. Especially when I re-watched it from the beginning and heard this guy's, David Lewis's, credentials. I don't know how you can graduate any institution of higher learning with the idea that all of your ideas do not have to be logically sound and philosophically solid. That stunned me. When I first heard him say that, I thought, well, he's just some layman who doesn't, he's probably some guy who just reads the Bible, some knucklehead like me. No, this is a smart guy. He's got a master's degree, and somehow he's under the impression that you can have ideas that are not logically sound and be true. I don't know how you do that. That seems crazy to me. Especially when, well, again, I don't want to get into that, and I don't want to hammer too hard. Again, I'm not trying to hammer this guy, because David Lewis is, again, a type of person out there who's got all the degrees, they've written books, they've done seminars, and you listen to their ideas and they're absolutely absurd. And you think, how do they give out these degrees if that's their thinking process? Some of my ideas, they need to be logically solid. But there are ideas that I can have that could make absolutely no logical sense, and that's okay too. And so the question becomes, why can't all ideas not make sense and be true? It's this special pleading that I think some theists have, thinking that if I read it in the Bible and it doesn't make sense, I'm going to say it's true anyway, even if it's logically contradictory. And I'm not going to dig further trying to see how I can reconcile these ideas or understand the data differently so I can remove the conflict. Because again, it's just my impression that God doesn't do things that are contradictory or tell us things that are contradictory. I think that's impossible for God to do. However, there's a lot of theists out there with a lot of wacky ideas. And when you go, that doesn't make sense. Oh, it's a mystery. We're just going to have to let that go. And listen, there are ideas that we just don't understand. But it seems a mistake to make an idea that you don't understand and don't know how it works the foundation of your worldview. Seems like you should just put that aside and go, listen, it seems like that's the case. But, until I really understand it, I'm not going to really push it as an actually true idea. That's how it seems to me. A little caution, a little humility. But to run out there with an idea that doesn't make any logical sense and say it's true, that was stunning to me with his academic credentials. That blew me away. And here's another thing. He said that when people critique him that he's, going into mystery all the time, his response is, well, you're looking for logic in everything. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Again, you know my position. It seems like everything should have some sort of a logical foundation if you're going to say it's true. There should be a solid logical framework that it sits in. And anything that comes outside of it, it's probably not the case. So when his retort to somebody who says you punt a mystery and David responds with, well, you're being too logical, I don't know if that makes any sense. I don't think that's the right response. If somebody says, you're not eating healthy, you should eat more healthy, do you respond with, well, you're eating too healthy? Is that a thing? Can you do that? Hey, you know what? You're late for work all the time. You should show up on time. Well, you're always on time. Is that how you respond to something like that? Just saying the opposite thing of what the person criticized you for, it's not a thinking person's way of responding. It's a childish way of responding. If somebody's giving you a criticism, oftentimes it's for your benefit. It's not to tear you down or for you to take personally. And I think when he gets this criticism that, hey, you're punting to mystery, I think the message is, it may not be a mystery. It's possible that you're not looking at the data properly. And if you looked at the data properly, the mystery would go away. I think that's what the criticism is. And if you're looking at it as a thinking person, criticisms can either be true or they can be false. But until you've examined it, you don't know. And just that response of your ideas are making too much sense, that just seems wrong-headed to me. But again, let's move on.
But I could accuse the other side of being overly rationalistic and trying to find philosophy and, find logic in everything and not say, well, there's a mystery to this. It doesn't make sense, but the biblical revelation teaches it. So the way I've heard this taught before is, you have a triangle and we'll say this triangle represents the sovereignty of God, or if you want to, determinism. But I like the sovereignty of God better. And then you have,
just so you know, sovereignty has nothing to do with determinism. Zero. And the reason he comes out, I think, with the idea that sovereignty and determinism are the same thing is because when it was taught to him, I'm just guessing, I don't know, he didn't think about it. Okay. You know what? Let me just, again, I know I'm stopping a lot, but let me just, it's important to talk about because there are a lot of problems with this analysis. Determinism, as I explained before, is the idea that everything you do is under God's control. Everything you do. You don't have a random thought, a feeling, or emotion, a movement that God didn't script out for you to do, think, or feel before you were even here. So if you're feeling something right now, it was impossible for you not to feel it. If you're watching this now, it would have been impossible 10 years ago for you to do anything else but sit down and watch me talking to my own camera. It was impossible. Why? Because according to the theistic determinist, God scripted that for you before you were even here, and it was impossible for you not to. So I just want to make it clear, it encompasses every single thing. There's nothing outside of determinism. That's the problem. Okay. Sovereignty is something totally different. Here's what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is simply the idea that whatever area that you have control over, you don't have to ask somebody's permission to do what you think is right in that area. That's what sovereignty is. So if you're a father or a mom or you got kids in the home, you're sovereign over your household. So what that means is, if you come home one day and you look in the kids' room and you go, you know what? I got two kids. They've got these two beds. I'm going to make them bunk beds. So that way they'll have more room to play. I can maybe put a desk in there and they can study. It'll be better. So I'm going to make bunk beds. When you do that, you don't have to ask anybody's permission because you're sovereign in your home. It has nothing to do with you being in control of what everybody does, right? Even if you come home and go into your kid's room and find out that they came up with the idea to make bunk beds, and their two beds are standing on top of each other, and you come in and they're looking at you and go, hey, mom, dad, is it okay? Well, the reason they're asking you if it's okay is because you're sovereign. Even though you didn't control what they did, you're sovereign over them, so they need your permission to do it. That's all sovereign means. The way these people, I was going to say knuckleheads, but they're not knuckleheads, although it's a knuckleheaded idea. It's the dumbest idea. To take determinism and make it equal sovereignty. And if he learned this in some theological, I don't know where he got this idea, but let me tell you, it's a popular idea out there with Calvinists, that somehow determinism and sovereignty are the same thing. And they have nothing to do with each other. One just means in an area over which you have control, you can do whatever you want and you don't have to ask anybody's permission because you're sovereign. Determinism is a wacky, nutty idea that's a philosophical idea. And it just seems to me that what the Calvinist has done is taken a philosophical idea and they're trying to shove it into theology. And that's how you get Calvinism. I think it's wrong-headed. And the only reason I think it's wrong-headed is because every illustration, every defense of it, every example of it, it's problematic in and of itself and never deals with the problems like we're going to see here. Now, again, I want to make this clear. I'm not against this kid. David Lewis seems like a really nice guy. I mean that. Both of them, Derek and David, seem like really nice kids. I say kids because I'm old. What I'm simply saying is you have to check everything everybody tells you. And I think David Lewis, if he was sitting in seminary class and somebody said sovereignty and determinism are the same thing from some professor, it would have been nice for him to go, you know what? Can you explain how that could possibly be? Can you show me how that works? And I think what happens, and I'm just guessing, I don't know, but I think people who are theologians or study theology, they somehow think that biblical truth is separate from logic and philosophy. And that there's biblical truth over here and there's philosophy over here, and you don't want to mix the two up. As if you can separate them. Any idea that any theologian has about anything is based on some philosophical framework. The framework is either solid or it's fractured and cracked. If the framework that their theological framework is based on a solid philosophical foundation, they're probably going to have some fantastic theological ideas. But if you're somebody like David Lewis, who thinks that all of your ideas don't have to be logically sound and be supported by a strong philosophical framework, some ideas can just be illogical and that's okay, you're going to have some terrible ideas. And again, I just don't know how higher these academic, these higher academic places of learning have these crazy ideas that they're teaching to other people. If that's where he got the idea, maybe he figured it out himself. I don't know, but this is just a terrible idea. But we'll look at it. I just want to make the point: sovereignty, determinism, not the same thing. And to equate the two is a mistake. That's all. Let's move on.
Of free will. And the idea is, okay, how is it that you could, oops, I just messed up my own stinking analogy, didn't I? Let me start again. Sorry about that. Live streaming here.
You're not an artist, huh?
No, I drew the wrong shape. Okay. The sovereignty of God here, or determinism, and free will. Okay. Now the question is, how can we have a shape that is both a triangle and a circle in the same shape? Well, the way you do that is you add a third dimension. So there is a shape that contains both a triangle and a circle in the same shape. It's called a cone. So a cone has the sovereignty of God and then the free will. And then this is how it was explained to me by a professor one time. And I think he got this analogy from physics. The difference between quarks and waves or something like that. Someone watching later will know what I'm talking about. Like there's a principle in physics where these two contradictory things are going on and it doesn't seem like they should be able to be, but they are. And so what we're saying is when we're looking at scripture, there's parts of scripture that have a strong statement of the sovereignty of God, right? And that's the triangle. Now because we are creatures trapped in time and we're not God, we have to understand that we look at these scripture that say the sovereignty of God, and you can't, like at that triangle right there, right? If you looked underneath it, there's a circle there. You just can't see it. Same thing with scriptures that talk about human responsibility. We have to choose, we have to repent, we have to believe. Yes, there's scriptures that are very strong about that, but behind that circle is a triangle. But because we're trapped in time, we can't see how the two things come together, and ultimately we will see that in eternity, but we can't see it now.
Okay, let's see if we can break this down. So in the triangle, he has sovereignty or determinism. Again, sovereignty and determinism have nothing to do with each other, but whatever. And in the circle, he has free will. Now, I just call it the will because I think free will is redundant, but that's a whole different thing. And his idea is, or an idea that he got from a professor, is that if you take determinism and put it in a triangle, and you take will and put it in a circle, and if you put them together, you fixed it somehow. That now it all works out. You can see one, but you can't see the other, but they're both there, right? And for some reason, David Lewis thinks this is a problem of temporality. For some reason, David Lewis thinks that this is because we're in time and God is outside of time, if in fact that's the case. I don't know if that's actually the case. I know there's some people who think that God is in time with us, but again, that's another idea. But my question is, well, why would this have anything to do with time? Right? Why would a contradiction be solved because of time? In other words, and again, this is that thing where I think some theists think that biblical ideas have this special place where they don't have to make sense. And I think that's wrong-headed. Because if you can solve this problem of being determined to do everything, yet having human responsibility, that contradiction, but somehow when we're in some atemporal state, suddenly it all goes away and we understand everything perfectly. And I'm not even saying that isn't the case. What I'm saying is, could you explain how that could possibly be and why I should believe that? Because so far, and again, I understand, or at least I'm assuming that this isn't meant to be a full presentation. So he's not explaining a lot of things. So I want to say that in David Lewis's defense. But if you're going to say this is a problem that's solved when time is no longer a factor, could you at least give us a reason why that would be true? Because if contradictions are solved because of an atemporal state, then again, 2 + 2 could equal 5 at some point, if it's atemporal. See, what David Lewis wants to do is limit this contradictory problem to just this right here. But I think what David Hackett's point is once you let that in the door, then the question is, why aren't all contradictions solved in an atemporal state? Right? Why isn't everything that's logically impossible suddenly possible in an atemporal state? You'd have to make that explanation. It seems that's just something you'd have to, an explanation you'd have to bring to bear. But I get the impression that, and I think it's probably because of the venue, because Derek is sitting there the whole time letting him do his presentations. And maybe after this, he will go, well, you know what? I have some questions. I don't think that's going to happen. That's why I'm asking the questions. And sometimes what happens is if you're in your little echo chamber with people who agree with you all the time, there's nobody to go, well, that idea you're putting out there is problematic for these reasons. And then David Lewis will go, well, gee whiz, let me think about that. Hopefully that's what he would do. And he can make his idea better or dump it all together. That's what I would do. But if he wants to hold on to the idea, he would have some ways to think about it and try and strengthen the idea. Because I got to be honest, this is the weakest presentation I've ever seen on this compatibilism thing. And not for just what you've heard. We're getting to the bad part of this thing. This is just heading up to the part that I just found was just terribly lacking. The point I'm making is people are always making assertions that X is true. If you're going to have an independent mind and be thinking independently so you're not suckered in by a lot of the BS that's coming out, and I got to tell you, well, I'm not going to say it's BS, although you have to think independently and ask yourself, what are they not telling me? Why are they not explaining this? Or why should I believe the thing that they just told me? Rather than, well, I heard it from a professor, so it must be true. Because even in this example, if it comes from quantum physics, like I think that's maybe what he's talking about, and I'm no nothing about quantum physics, but if I understand correctly, there's no contradiction in quantum physics. They don't know how it works, but there's no contradiction in the moving of a particle, whether it's a wave or moving as a particle. They just don't know how it does that. So I think even in that, this doesn't work. But that's not what we're here to talk about. Let me tell you why this illustration is problematic. There's two problems here. The first is conceptual, and the second is practical. Now, the practical one is the one that hit me first, but we'll end with that because the conceptual one, I think, takes a little bit more to explain. So he's using shapes to represent logical contradictions. So let me just spend a second talking about logical contradictions. A logical contradiction essentially is this. You have an idea and you express it with words. The sky is blue. Okay. Well, that word you express has what's called, I think it's called propositional content. It says something about the world. And a proposition is either true or it's false. It has that property. That's what a proposition is. It's some idea about the world, and it's either true or it's false. Okay? The problem with shapes is shapes are neither true or false. Shapes are just shapes. They have no propositional content. They don't tell you anything about the world. And so to use something that has no propositional content to represent something that does have propositional content already is wrong-headed because they're not the same thing. See, the problem with that is that you can combine circles and shapes, circles and triangles in any configuration you want. You can make a cone out of them. You can put one on top of the other. You can put one inside the other. And there's no problem because there's nothing about a triangle that negates the existence of a circle. And there's nothing about a circle that negates the existence of a triangle. So putting them together, having them on top of each other at a cone, whatever it is, doesn't solve anything because they're shapes and have no propositional content. But ideas have propositional content, and that's why it's wrong-headed to use shapes to illustrate how two things that are impossible to be together go together. Because what happens when you say a proposition, sometimes a proposition doesn't tell you about the world. Sometimes it tells you something that the world could not possibly be. So again, if I said the sky is blue, and the sky is actually true, that's a true proposition, then it's impossible that the sky could at that same time be any other color. It's like Hackett was saying, a contradiction, two things can't be the same thing in the same way at the same time in the same place. So the propositional statement that the propositional content of the statement, the sky is blue, negates the sky being any other color if this is true. So the problem with these two contradictory statements is both can't exist or both cannot be true. But that's not what you have with circles and squares. where to go? Oh, you don't have that with circles and squares. There's nothing about a triangle that makes a circle not true, and vice versa. Because, again, triangles and circles can't be true or not true. They're just triangles and circles. They have no propositional content. So it's impossible. It's a wrong-headed idea to use these shapes to express contradictions. They're the wrong thing. Okay. Now, you might think, well, Kev, that's phony. I don't agree with that. There's all kinds of problems with it. And there may be. But there's another reason why this is a bad idea. And again, it goes to the special pleading that many theists do, thinking that biblical ideas somehow don't have to conform to the logic of the rest of reality. Look at this. Let's say that you and I were talking, and I told you, I've always lived in Texas my whole life. And you go, oh, that's interesting. And then right on the heels of that, I said, but let me tell you about the time that I was in Las Vegas. I had a great time. You go, okay, what do you got to say? Because there's no problem. The content of I live in Texas and have always lived in Texas has no contradiction with the time I was in Las Vegas. There's no problem there. But what if I said this? Not only have I always lived in Texas, but I've never been outside the state of Texas my whole life. But let me tell you about the time I was in Las Vegas. Well, what you would do at that point, you go, well, hold on now. If you've never been out of the state of Texas, how could you possibly had any kind of a time in Las Vegas, good or bad? Why? Because the content of the first statement, the propositional content, negates the possibility that that second proposition could be true. That's the problem with determinism and human responsibility. The idea of determinism negates the possibility of human responsibility. That's the problem. That's the conflict. And so to use circles to put them together and suddenly there's a conflict doesn't make any sense. And let me show you what I mean. So here is the propositional content. Let me see. How do I get to this? Here we go. Okay. So the propositional content in the first statement, I've never been outside of Las Vegas, and the propositional statement of the second one, but let me tell you about the time I was in Las Vegas. You put the first one in a triangle, you put the second one in a circle, does not equal, I've never been outside of Las Vegas, and I had a great time I've never been outside of Texas, and I had a great time in Las Vegas. It does not equal that. It doesn't matter what shape you use. You can use boxes, octagons, it doesn't matter because shapes have no propositional content. What about this one? I have no money. I don't have $0 to my name. I have no access to money. But I just bought a brand new car. That doesn't happen. Just by putting I have no money in a triangle and I bought a new car in a circle doesn't equal me buying a new car with no money. It doesn't work. And so the idea that you can put it in a circle and see one and not the other, it all means nothing. Shapes do not erase contradictions. If it was possible, I could buy a car with no money and I could never be out of the state of Texas and have a great time in Las Vegas, if that was the case. But shapes have no propositional content. So using those to illustrate how you can fix a contradiction is wrong-headed. And that was the first thing that struck me. I'm like, boy, if you can fix a contradiction with a cone or with a triangle and a circle, then there's no such thing as a contradiction anymore. All we have to do is to wait till time is over and everything is possible. Well, no, that's not the way it is. It's just wrong-headed. And the reason I brought this up again, I'm not banging on these two guys. And I know I'm banging on this guy, David Lewis, but I'm not saying he's a bad guy. I think what you just heard from David Lewis is symptomatic of a system, and I don't want to say system because that's used too much. It's symptomatic of a world that doesn't encourage people to think for themselves. You sit down in any kind of seminary class, you sit down in church, you sit down behind the news, you sit down at some YouTube, whatever it is, and somebody starts talking and your mind shuts off. And whatever they tell you, you just believe it and repeat it to the next person. And this thing that he's put up there, it is clear. He hasn't thought about this. David Lewis has not thought about this and the problems that I just brought up. And listen, as we know, he's a smart guy. He has a master's degree. I'm an idiot. I dropped out of college. So if I can think about this and come up with these problems, why didn't he? I don't think he's thinking about it. I think that a lot of times we just want to hear ideas or things that support our idea. That's our feminine side. We want to hear anything that affirms what we already believe and it makes us feel better about what we think and about us. But to hear criticism about your idea, oh man, we don't like that. We don't want anybody criticizing us. Even when that criticism might be the thing, criticism might be the thing that makes your ideas better. But we don't want to hear that. And I think that it would have been nice if Derek sitting next to him, but maybe Derek's looking at it and going, yeah, it's a great idea. But I just, again, I know I'm hammering on these guys, and it's not a personal thing. They seem like really good people. I mean that. But boy, I was blown away when I saw this, and David thought this was a good idea. And he has a master's in theology or seminary or whatever that is. And my thought is, I don't know what they're teaching him. Logic is the foundation. Philosophy is the foundation. And if your ideas are logically sound in a solid framework of good philosophy, you're going to have some really great ideas. But if you abandon it thinking, well, because it's the Bible, it doesn't have to be logical, you're going to have some wacky ass ideas. I'm sorry. That's just what's going to happen. And I think that's what's going on here. Because just a little bit, and again, I'm no genius. I'm not even close. But just a little bit of intellectual scrutiny, unless I'm wrong. Listen, you look at this for yourself. You tell me, Kev, you don't even know what you're talking about. That might be the case too. But if I'm right, this is horrible. This is horrible for, again, someone who has a master's degree to think this is a great idea. There's something wrong there. And someone at some point in his life should have told him, you know what, David, there's some problems with this. You should think about this a little bit more and maybe think about these things before you put that out there. Listen, I don't have any friends. There's nobody telling me what. That's why so many of the things I say are so bad. But it seems like Dave's hooked up. He's got a family, friends, and all that stuff. Seminary school. I'm sure he knows a bunch of people. Somebody should have told him about this because this is terrible. This is terrible. This shows no lack of critical, independent thought at all. It's not good. All right, that's enough of that. So again, the only point I'm trying to make is it's not just Derek. It's not just Calvinism. If you want to be a Calvinist, that's your thing. You do what you want to do. But there's a lot of terrible ideas out there. A lot. And they continue to be promulgated. Is that the word, promulgated? Maybe. Because we don't think independently. We want to, get the A in our professor's class, so we just repeat what he says. When the professor pulls out this illustration, we go, well, professor, shapes, what does that have to do with contradictions? Somebody should ask that question. But I guess you don't ask those questions in seminary school because you're taught to listen, repeat what you're said, and it happens everywhere. Same thing in church, same thing with the news, you name it. And my only goal is to say, listen, maybe some of the things that people are telling you are complete BS or just at least wrong. Let's just say that. But you'll never know it until you take a moment and just think about it. God has given us the ability to think for ourselves. He's given us the reason to see the logic that he's created the world with. And I think that God is perfect in his logic. And I think that the world that he created is perfectly logical. The idea that there's some ideas that you're going to have that don't conform to logic or philosophy, I just think that's wrong-headed and will make you think that these things are really great ideas. I just think that's bad. All right, that's enough. I've said that enough. I keep rambling. Thanks for listening to the show today, and I appreciate you guys coming back. Please comment, please like, subscribe, and do all the things that they say. I appreciate it. And next time we'll do something a little bit different. But again, if you think I'm wrong, you let me know, and I'll hopefully it'll help me make some of my wacky ideas better. All right, get out of here. That's enough.